From the moment I moved into the neighborhood, I could feel her eyes on me. The woman across the street, who the neighbors whispered about and only ever referred to as Karen, watched every movement, every car, every guest, every small moment of my daily life as if she had been assigned to monitor me personally. She didn't hide it either. She stood outside with a phone in her hand like a weapon, poised to capture or report anything that didn't fit her rigid standards. And in this neighborhood, her standards were dangerously low. The first complaint arrived before I had even finished unpacking boxes. A warning from the HOA about excessive activity around the property, filed within hours of my cousins helping with a few pieces of furniture. It felt ridiculous at first, almost comical, until the next notice came, and then the next, each one escalating with a precision too sharp to be coincidence. They always centered on guests, visitors, people simply stepping onto my driveway for a few minutes. And every time, when I looked outside after reading a new complaint, I saw Karen retreating toward her front door, her expression cold and triumphant, as though she had just won another round in a silent war. I didn't know I was part of that. It didn't take long to realize that she was reporting every person who came near my house. Delivery drivers, friends dropping something off, even a neighbor who stopped by to return a ladder. The HOA messages became more aggressive, accusing me of causing disturbances, non-compliant gatherings, and ongoing guest violations. The language felt exaggerated, almost theatrical, as if the board believed they were dealing with a large-scale party house rather than a quiet single-family home. And behind every message was Karen. I could feel her influence in the tone of each warning, her presence lingering in every accusation. The neighborhood soon began to feel like a stage she controlled. Whenever a car slowed down in front of my house, she appeared outside, arms crossed, phone ready. Whenever someone stepped onto my porch, she watched with the intensity of a security guard catching a thief. Her fixation grew so obvious that even the mailman mentioned her in passing, shaking his head as he hurried away from her scrutinizing stare. But the real breaking point arrived on a calm Saturday morning. Quiet, peaceful, the kind of day where nothing dramatic should happen. A friend visited for a few minutes, parking legally at the curb. We remained outside the entire time, talking softly, disturbing no one. Yet somehow, before the afternoon ended, a new email from the HOA appeared in my inbox. The subject line was harsher than anything I'd seen so far. The board claimed I was creating an ongoing nuisance, citing multiple neighbor complaints, and threatened immediate fines if I continued hosting unregistered visitors. I didn't need to wonder who those neighbors were. There was only one person here who monitored my driveway like it was a restricted zone. Something shifted inside me that day. Frustration turned into resolve, and resolve sharpened into something colder, more focused. I realized that as long as Karen controlled the narrative, I would always be the villain she wanted me to be. The HOA had no reason to doubt her as long as they never witnessed the reality for themselves. She knew how to twist small moments into imaginary violations, and she had mastered presenting herself as the innocent enforcer of peace. That I decided it was time to change the script. Instead of trying to defend myself, I began documenting everything. Dates, times, every complaint, every harmless visit she turned into a scandal. And her behavior gave me plenty of material. I started noticing how she paced her driveway at predictable times, scanning for any sign of a visitor. She recorded cars that slowed near my property. She photographed people walking past my lawn, even if they didn't stop. She had built her entire routine around waiting for me to break a rule she invented. That I saw through her game completely, and I knew the HOA had to see it too. That was when the idea struck. Simple, clean, devastating. That if Karen wanted to show the HOA how terrible my guest behavior was, then I would show the HOA what she was really doing. I contacted the HOA compliance officer directly, requesting an in-person inspection to clear up what I called a pattern of conflicting reports. I didn't need to explain the full situation. I only needed him to come, observe, and witness her in her natural, chaotic, rule-obsessed habitat. And he agreed. The morning of the inspection felt strangely calm. The street was quiet, the air still. I didn't invite anyone over. I didn't step outside. I didn't give Karen even a hint of activity to feed on. I wanted the officer to approach a completely normal day, so when Karen manufactured a disturbance, It would expose the truth more brutally than anything I could say. When the compliance officer's car rolled into the cul-de-sac, I watched from behind the blinds. He parked near the curb, stepping out with his clipboard, scanning the neighborhood with the kind of professional neutrality she would never be able to manipulate. He began his slow walk toward my property, noting numbers, examining the exterior, surveying the lawn. That's when she emerged. Karen shot out of her house with the intensity of someone afraid of missing her moment. She moved fast, her posture stiff with purpose, her expression twisted into a mask of authority she clearly believed she held. Even from the window, I could see the tension in her jaw as she closed the distance between herself and the officer, pointing toward my home with sharp, erratic movements that exposed her barely contained fury. She hadn't seen anything. She hadn't heard anything. Nothing had happened. But to her, his presence alone was enough justification to launch into accusations. Her gestures grew more exaggerated, her frustration more visible, her obsession impossible to hide. The officer watched her silently as she animated herself into a frenzy, scribbling notes that made her visibly more anxious. She stepped closer and closer, invading the officer's personal space in her desperation to convince him of some fantasy disturbance. And the best part, there were no guests. No noise. No activity. Not even a shadow out of place. Her entire performance was unfolding over absolutely nothing. The officer continued writing. Karen continued unraveling from behind the blinds. I knew this was the moment I had been waiting for. The first crack in the facade she had built, exposed not by me but by her own compulsive need to control everything around her. For the first time since she targeted me, the power had shifted, and as the officer walked away from her toward the rest of my property, leaving her standing alone and visibly rattled, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The real showdown was only beginning. The compliance officer moved through my property with calm, methodical steps, completely unaware of how closely he was being watched by the very person who had engineered this entire situation. Karen stood frozen on her driveway, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her plan, to control the story, to shape the narrative, to pressure the HOA into hammering me, was slipping through her fingers with every note the officer took. Yet she couldn't stop herself. Even when there was nothing happening, she invented urgency. Scanning the area for any detail she could twist into wrongdoing, her eyes darted from him, to my house, back to him again, each moment more frantic than the last. She moved along her driveway as though trying to find a better angle, a better justification, a better something to support whatever version of reality she was fabricating. And the more she panicked, the clearer it became. She wasn't fighting for rules. She was fighting for control. Inside my home, watching from behind the blinds, I felt the shift in the air, an invisible tension stretching tight, drawn like a bowstring ready to snap. For months I had carried the weight of her false reports, her constant surveillance, her invasive obsession. Now the balance was beginning to tilt, and she felt it. Her desperation grew sharper, more obvious, as if she feared the truth was about to be exposed. The compliance officer walked the side of my house slowly, noting the neat landscaping, the absence of debris, the completely quiet environment. He checked the fence line, examined the yard, saw no signs of gatherings, no chairs, no equipment, no setup that could support any of the disturbances Karen claimed. He even paused beside the mailbox, the same mailbox she had accused me of modifying without approval, only to find it perfectly standard. With every step he took, Karen's agitation grew more visible. She followed him at a distance, pacing back and forth, pretending to examine her own yard as if that somehow hid her fixation. But she kept glancing over her shoulder, timing her movements to stay within earshot. She couldn't stand the idea that someone from the HOA might form an unbiased opinion without her influence. Finally, the officer stepped into the backyard to complete his inspection. I moved silently to the back windows, watching him follow the concrete path while Karen hovered near the fence line, her posture stiff with frustration. She leaned in as though hoping to overhear something, anything that might give her a foothold. But the officer moved with deliberate neutrality, taking photos, jotting down observations, offering her nothing to anchor her accusations to. Then something unexpected happened. The officer paused midway through the yard, noticing a narrow strip of earth along the fence that bordered Karen's property. The soil was disturbed, the grass uneven, a clear sign someone had walked or trampled there repeatedly. He angled his camera toward it, recording the marks. I knew exactly how they got there. Karen often cut through that side of my property during her surveillance rounds, circling the fence line as though inspecting it for violations she hoped to find. I had seen her do it more than once, pacing in broad daylight like the yard belonged to her. She didn't realize the officer had spotted this detail until he turned and photographed her yard as well, documenting the symmetry of her footsteps keeping pace with her obsession. Her eyes widened, her body freezing mid-step. She hadn't anticipated that her own patterns, the evidence of her monitoring, would become part of the inspection. She quickly retreated to her side, trying to act casual, but the forced normalcy in her posture failed to hide the panic beginning to bloom across her expression. The officer wrote another note, and Karen's throat visibly tightened. She had expected to be the hero of this story. Instead, she was becoming the exhibit. The officer eventually returned to the front yard, completing the inspection. I left the blinds a fraction open, watching as he took another quiet note, this time directed more toward the street than the house. It took me a moment to realize what had caught his attention. Then I saw it too. Karen had positioned a set of small, discreet solar cameras facing directly at my property. Not toward the street. Not toward her own yard. Not toward anything that made sense for security. Every single one was angled at my driveway, my porch, my windows. It was more than surveillance, it was obsession. The officer documented each one. Karen froze, her mouth parted in shock, and even from inside my home, I could almost feel the panic radiating from her. She had spent months accusing me of disturbances, of improper guests, of noise, of imaginary violations, while she herself had set up a private monitoring system targeting my home. She didn't expect the officer to notice. She didn't expect him to question why any resident would need multiple cameras pointed at a neighbor. But he noticed everything, and he wrote every detail into his report. The inspection should have ended there, yet Karen couldn't restrain herself. She stepped forward again, moving with the stiff, urgent energy of someone trying to salvage a collapsing story. She gestured wildly toward my house, her movements frantic, her breathing shallow. It was the gesture of someone trying to reframe the narrative, to redirect attention, to regain control of a situation that was slipping through her fingers at terrifying speed. But the officer didn't react. He didn't nod. He didn't agree. He simply observed her with the same calm neutrality he had maintained the entire time, making one last note before signaling that his inspection was complete. And then, with the professional distance of someone who had seen more than enough, he walked calmly back to his car. Karen stood frozen, rooted in place, watching him leave with an expression that bordered on dread. Her mind must have been racing. She had thrown accusation after accusation at me, but now the HOA had witnessed firsthand that nothing she reported existed. The officer saw the truth. A quiet property, a normal homeowner, and a neighbor whose surveillance crossed clear lines. Inside my house, I felt a slow, steady shift in my chest, a release of pressure I had carried for far too long. But I also knew something deeper was happening. Karen wasn't just in trouble. She was unraveling, and she knew it, because for the first time, she wasn't the one controlling the narrative. She wasn't the one feeding information to the HOA. She wasn't the unseen voice shaping the rules. Someone else now held the story. Someone with authority. And someone who had seen everything. The inspection was over, but the fallout hadn't even begun. The compliance officer left quietly, but the shockwaves he triggered lingered long after his car disappeared from view. Karen stood on her driveway, frozen, her body rigid, her face pale with disbelief. Every step she had taken over the past months, every complaint she had filed, every accusation she had sent to the HOA, it was all now exposed as obsessive, unnecessary, and completely unwarranted. For the first time, her authority crumbled in front of someone who didn't answer to her whims, someone who didn't fear her manufactured drama. The neighborhood, usually silent on matters like this, was about to witness something extraordinary. By mid-afternoon, the HOA had already started calling homeowners in for clarification. The officer's report was precise, detailed, and damning. It documented every false accusation, every fabricated violation, and the troubling surveillance habits that Karen had undertaken to monitor me. The photos of her cameras aimed directly at my property, the timing of her pacing, even the minute footprints in the side yard. All evidence pointed to an obsession, not a homeowner maintaining community standards. It was a meticulous record, impossible for the board to ignore. And they didn't. Within hours, HOA board members began sending notices, not to me, but to Karen. They demanded explanations. They questioned her behavior. They required her to remove the surveillance equipment immediately, threatening fines for noncompliance. The same woman who had tried to control my every interaction, who had weaponized the HOA against me for months, now faced the very structure she had manipulated. The tables had turned, and the neighborhood buzzed with the news. Karen reacted exactly as I had anticipated. Desperately. She tried to justify her actions, claiming she was protecting property values, ensuring safety, and enforcing community rules. But her story held no weight against the officer's first-hand observations. The HOA, for once, sided with facts over fear, with evidence over intimidation. They sent her a formal reprimand and a deadline to comply with the officer's recommendations. Every day she hesitated to remove the cameras, she accrued fines. Every day she tried to escalate, she dug herself deeper. Her carefully curated image of authority crumbled as neighbors began to whisper openly, pointing out how her obsession had escalated far beyond reasonable behavior to BY evening. The gossip had spread across the entire cul-de-sac. Neighbors who had quietly endured her scrutiny for months now watched as she attempted, in vain, to reclaim her standing. Children who had once been shushed away by her threats played freely, their laughter no longer a source of complaint. Friends who had avoided my home out of fear now arrived without hesitation, openly enjoying small visits without the tension of looming threats. Every subtle act of normal life, gardening, chatting, parking a car, became a quiet act of rebellion against her dominance. The real climax, however, came when the HOA called a special board meeting the following week. Karen appeared, document in hand, prepared to defend herself. She hoped to salvage control, to reclaim her reputation, to reassert the authority she had wielded so ruthlessly. But as she stepped into the room, she immediately recognized the weight against her. The compliance officer attended the meeting as a witness, providing every detail from his inspection, including timestamps, photos, and exact notes of her obsessive surveillance. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and fully documented. The room felt electric, charged with tension as Karen realized she had overplayed her hand. Every accusation she had leveled at me was countered with documented proof of her obsession. Every complaint filed in my absence now looked like a deliberate attempt to harass a neighbor. Her attempts to explain the photos, the pacing, and the constant scrutiny faltered, leaving her vulnerable. Members of the board exchanged glances, quietly noting the discrepancies in her story. What she had expected to be a show of control became an unraveling of her credibility in real time. Every second of her testimony seemed to tighten the noose around her reputation. By the end of the meeting, the HOA issued its final decision. Karen was reprimanded formally, her surveillance equipment had to be removed immediately, and fines were assessed for each violation. Additionally, the HOA made a clear statement to all residents. No individual could manipulate the association for personal vendettas. The statement sent a strong message: behavior like Karen's would no longer be tolerated. She had tried to weaponize authority, but the system, for once, operated as intended. The neighborhood's reaction was immediate. Relief replaced tension. Small acts of normalcy turned into celebrations of quiet victory. People smiled, children played freely, and neighbors who had previously avoided interaction began visiting again. Even the HOA acknowledged that her behavior had been extreme, and they thanked me for bringing it to light. The satisfaction wasn't just in clearing my name, it was seeing the community reclaim its equilibrium from someone who had destabilized it for months. Karen, on the other hand, retreated. Her posture, once rigid and commanding, was now slouched and defensive. Her attempts to engage with neighbors were met with polite but distant smiles. The influence she had wielded over the cul-de-sac had evaporated, leaving her isolated and exposed. Her obsession, which had once terrified residents, had become a spectacle, a cautionary tale of how power can unravel when misused. As the weeks passed, the street returned to normal. The officer's report remained on file, a permanent record of the truth. The HOA had strengthened its policies to prevent individual residents from exploiting their position, and I finally regained peace on my property. Friends came and went without fear. Gatherings, small and harmless, could occur without complaint. The lingering shadow that had hovered over my home, the ever-watchful eyes of a neighbor obsessed with control, was gone. And in the quiet aftermath, I realized something important. The conflict hadn't been about guests, noise, or property lines. It had been about authority, perception, and control. Karen had believed she could dictate reality through fear, and she had underestimated the power of transparency and impartial observation. The officer's visit had done more than document facts. It had exposed her obsession for what it was, providing a climax that no complaint, no email, and no manipulative effort could counter. By the time the neighborhood returned to its normal rhythm, the story had already spread. Residents spoke of the dramatic inspection, the undeniable evidence, and the final meeting in hushed tones of awe. It became a legend, a tale of persistence, patience, and the ultimate victory of truth over obsession. And every time I walked past the driveway that once seemed like a battleground, I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing the neighborhood had finally been set free from the grip of one person's controlling gaze. The lesson was clear, and the aftermath unforgettable. Sometimes, the best defense isn't confrontation. It's patience, preparation, and letting authority witness the truth unfold. Karen had tried to ban my guests, control my life, and manipulate the HOA. But when the proper observer entered the scene, the scales tipped, the truth revealed itself, and the fallout was nothing short of legendary.